All right. I think we can get started. And I would like to begin by first welcoming everybody and thanking everyone for coming to today's webinar. I guess as we get started, I will start sharing the screen. Give me 1 minute. All right. Again, thanks everyone for coming to today's webinar entitled Harmonizing Global Engagement, Indigenous Worldviews in Internationalization of Higher Education. I would like to acknowledge, the lens that we are presenting from, particularly the fact that next week we are going to meet in person in Minneapolis, which is the traditional ancestral homeland of Dakota Oyate, the original inhabitants and stewards of the land and waterways of Minneapolis, Minnesota. Right now, so first of all, my name is Chung Kim. I'm an associate professor of higher education at the University of Maryland, which means I am connecting from the ancestral lands of Piscataway people, who are the ancestral stewards of this sacred land. It is their historical responsibility to advocate for the four-legged, the winged, those that crawl, and those that swim. They remind us that clean air and pristine waterways are essential to all life. With that, I'm going to start by sharing some announcement coming from the Council for International Higher Education. First of all, I would like to introduce the Executive Committee of CIHE. Particularly want to thank Dr. Christina Yao, our chair of CIHE, and Hannah Ho, Communications Coordinator, for supporting today's webinar. Please join our community. We encourage you to engage with the ASHE CIHE community by joining as a member of ASHE. In the registration, you can indicate your interest in becoming the member for Council for International Higher Education. You can use the barcode here on the QR code to scan and become one of our members. One of the things that I would like to highlight, we are going to have our pre-conference starting on November 15th. So the night before, Tuesday evening, we will have an informal social in the conference hotel. There will be some light snacks, so please drop in anytime between 6 and 8 p.m. Minneapolis time, and we'll be there. Please come join us meeting your colleagues who are members of CIHE, and it will be a great start for our pre-conference. Again, there is a QR code that you can scan and fill out the form so we can anticipate how many will be there approximately. But still, please come join us. Also, would like to highlight the Critical Internationalization Studies Network. Please check out this website and consider becoming the community members. I'll hand it over to my colleague, Dr. Castillo.
Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. Good morning, afternoon, evening, depending on where you're in the world. We have a very exciting panel this day, and I'm very excited to be moderating it with my colleague, Dr. Chung Kim. My name is Santiago Castillo, and I'm an assistant professor at Seton Hall University in what is called today New Jersey in the United States, the ancestral lands of the Lenni Lenape people. And for this, the program for today, for this keynote session for the pre-conference of the Council for International Higher Education, it's a panel called Harmonizing Global Engagement, Indigenous Worldviews in Internationalization of Higher Education. And for this panel, we're really excited to have 5 amazing scholars joining us from different parts of the world to have a very engaging conversation and discussion. So I'll briefly introduce them, but I will let them introduce themselves when they have their initial participation. So just in alphabetical order by last name, first we will hear from Dr. Sonia Fonua from the University of Auckland in New Zealand. Then we will also hear from Dr. Gonzalo Isidro from Education First International Language in Honolulu, Hawaii. We will also be hearing today from Dr. Doris Sáez, Hueichapan, sorry, I hope I said that correctly, from Universidad de Chile in Chile. Then we'll hear from Dr. Elizabeth Sumida Huaman. She is currently a professor at the University of Minnesota. And last but not least, we'll hear from Dr. Sharon Stein, who's also a professor at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, Canada. The agenda or the logistics for this panel is we'll give each of the participants some time, around 7 minutes or so, to share with us different projects and scholarly work that they're doing. And then we'll have some time for interaction between the panel. But most importantly, we would like to hear from our attendees. So you have the option of sending your questions along via the chat or via the Q&A option in Zoom. So please feel free to start sending those questions as our participants are presenting, and we'll make sure to go back to those questions and start moderating a panel after the last participant finishes with their initial remarks. So without further ado, the floor is yours, Dr. Sonia Fonua from the University of Auckland.
Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. My name is Sonia Fonua. I feel really uncomfortable going first, if I can be honest, because I'm not Indigenous. I just want to signal that. So alphabetically, I've managed to be the white person that goes first. I am based in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and I acknowledge the Indigenous people of that land in everything I do. The Māori came to New Zealand a long time ago and are the first people of this land, which is why I refer to it as Aotearoa. It's part of the name that was given to the land. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about what I've been doing, why I've been doing it, and I guess just share that. And I'd also like to thank you all for attending the session and for the invitation to be here. Positioning myself, my ancestry is European. My husband is Tongan. He was born in Tonga and moved to Aotearoa, New Zealand when he was about 3 or 4, and so has grown up as a Tongan New Zealander. And we raise our children in a way that I'd use this image to depict that by weaving together lalanga, our ancestry, so that our children have a strong understanding of both lineages and are confident in who they are. So this is a Tongan mat, and then the addition of the wool, which is not Indigenous to the Pacific region by any means. It'd be too hot for the sheep, but this is how I represent that, and this is the 3 of them here, 3 boys, yes. As you can see, this is pretty much depicts my life all over the place, fighting different directions. So everything I do is with the perspective of improving education so that they can be themselves when they are in higher education. And I use that perspective to also consider that I'm working with other people's children and loved one, and I want to put them first as much as I can. So just in case you're not sure where New Zealand is, we're down here. So if you look at these maps, we're always put to the side. So I just wanted to make sure everyone knew where I was actually speaking from. And this is one of the things that I do often to present Indigenous knowledges in my classes, is go, actually, this dominates worldviews. Let's make sure that we actually try and put ourselves centrally and position ourselves as important and in the middle of things. And so we look for maps where we're actually, the islands are present and we are not off to the side or left off entirely, or some of our islands left off. Because we actually, as a region, are massive and unfortunately are overlooked a lot of the time because of the dominant powers in the globe, but we have a lot to offer, and so that's what I draw my inspiration and knowledges from, which is what I'm going to share. So when I spoke to the organisers, we thought it would be important to share the context, because I come from, I guess, a particular context where we have actually a very strong positioning of our Indigenous peoples. We can look at that critically and say it's not strong enough, but internationally it is often a benchmark that other Indigenous peoples are aiming to achieve the political representation, the positioning, the resourcing that we have. And that's because we have this document called Te Tiriti o Waitangi, which is our founding document that was signed in 1840 between the British, and some, but not all, of the iwi leaders. So iwi is referring to a group of Māori that are connected by whakapapa, by lineage, by relationship. And there's an ongoing debate around this, if anyone's connected or interested in the politics of Aotearoa New Zealand. And that's because there's two different versions. There's an English version, and then there's a version written in Māori, and they don't translate exactly the same. And that's why there are issues around our political interpretations of things. This is around whether governance was ceded or sovereignty was ceded. I could talk more about this, but that's not what I'm here to do. But I think it's important to understand the context that I come from and the positioning of Indigenous people, maybe compared to the context of others. So I did my PhD part-time because I was really interested in understanding particularly why Pacific learners coming from the region to Aotearoa had really strong science backgrounds, whereas the students that I was encountering in higher education who had been raised in Aotearoa, New Zealand, Pacific students, weren't so strong. And I was very interested in why that was. Obviously, there's a lot to that, which we can't get into. And so I started my PhD in 2013, and then I promptly got pregnant. So I managed to deal with these things all at the same time. And I was really interested in what was important to engage learners, what made them enjoy what they were doing, and then how was that making them successful based on their own individual definitions of success. And I talked to 26 successful Tongan science learners who were at the institution that I work at, the University of Auckland, to understand their experiences of their education and higher education, but also their journey through secondary schooling. And half of them had been educated in the Kingdom of Tonga and then moved to Aotearoa for their education at tertiary level, higher education, and the other half had been educated solely in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Very different experiences, and also going back to what I said about the students coming from the islands to our country, very different understandings and I guess internal understandings of themselves as a science learner, much stronger coming from the islands, much more positive. So I was interested in those different levels of education and looking at what they were telling me, but also working in the area that I worked in and continue to work in. I came up with various different models and things around how to teach, how to think about what they were telling me, and also how to think about bringing together the theoretical framings of my PhD. And these are represented visually. I'm a visual person, so I like to have pictures. It's one of the key parts of how I teach and share information is through imagery and art practice. And what I'm going to talk about mostly is how I bring this knowledge into the classroom and recognizing that as a non-Indigenous person, as a Papalangi, so as a white person, what am I doing in my practice to engage with my Indigenous learners and also to educate our non-Indigenous learners so that we can all come together, la langa, so we are stronger in our understanding and respect for each other. I've been working on a project because I have a lot of critical friends who are very happy to tell me where I'm not doing things very well, including students, and I really respect and am very grateful that I have that. And not everybody else has that, yet we're asking people to be able to teach Indigenous students when they maybe don't have the capacity or the background to understand what is needed or what they need to do personally. So I started in 2018 a fellowship where I spent the year doing that. I worked with non-Indigenous science educators to upskill themselves, to critically reflect on what they're doing and not doing, and how they could do things to engage their Indigenous learners, their Māori learners and their Pacific learners. And this project is called Lalanga Hakaha Umonawea, which is a Tongan phrase for weaving together for a better future. And that's necessary if we want to be able to improve education, is to be able to work together. So I did this because I ended up turning my PhD into having an element of critical self-reflection, so because I was being critiqued in my own practice at the same time by students. So I was thinking about how I could change what I was doing to better engage the students I was doing. And this was very, very helpful and informative. And it's something that other people I knew would benefit from. This is mostly because I use this image because these people all believe they're doing a squat. But what they're actually all doing is demonstrating their own positioning with the respect to the ability to do that. And so not everybody is equipped to be able to engage Indigenous learners the same way. And I use this image to talk to educators around that, and that we may all be wanting to be able to do a squat like these people, but we might be sort of over here exhausted, not sure where to even start. So this is, I guess, probably the main reason that I'm here, is I wrote a piece about this model, which I showed you before, which came out of my PhD. And this is a representation, again, a visual, because I prefer visuals, a visualization of 5 key elements that Timothy Violetti wrote about, which are necessary for talanoa, which is a Tongan word for open conversation, and it's a concept that's found across the Pacific region. It's a conversation with no agenda. It's a conversation that's started to see where it goes. But to be able to do that, you need to have these 5 elements, and these are key elements for Tongans in this engagement. And I use this model to talk to the students on the first day that I have with them in any class about how to think about being in a space. And so we start with values. We don't start with content or assessments or anything like that. They start with this. It's a bit of a shock sometimes for science students to be hit with values, but I expect them to work with others and to respect the space that they're learning in, so that they can not talk when the guest lecturers are there, and also recognize that their peers want to learn, so they need to be respectful. So I talk these words through, and this is likely to be the first time most students have ever seen Tongan. There's not a huge population of Tongans. If they're going to see a Pacific language at the University of Auckland, it will be Samoan. So I bring this into the classroom to be able to visualize and respect that there's other Pacific languages. Pacific is not one thing, it's many, many, many countries, languages, cultures, peoples, ways of doing things. And so we speak through these, and I talk about whakaapa and how I'm going to show them respect as the educator by doing whatever it is that I say in relation to the class that I'm in. But also I talk to the fact that we all can demonstrate respect differently. And so what I consider to be respect could be quite different to what an individual student in the classroom deems as respectful. And they can be completely contradictory, which is why somebody may look to you that they're being rude, but that's actually the most respectful behavior that they can present to you. So speaking through these different Indigenous ways of doing things, and then welcoming the students to bring their own values and ways of doing things into the classroom as well. So we do a tutorial activity in the first week where students work together in a small group, and they annotate an image. We give them a copy of this, and they annotate this image to add the values in their own languages and other values that they think are important for working with others. So we're bringing forward the importance of relationality before we get into content and assessment. I do all sorts of other things, which is really just decolonizing what is science. So I ask them all this question, what is science? And we go through a process where most of them can't even actually tell you what that is. And I'm like, well, you're doing a science degree, what are you doing that in? So we go through this various different illustrations of science must be a clipboard, but actually there's all these other things that demonstrate science. So I bring in elements of Pacific wayfinding. So knowledge is around navigation, which requires a huge amount of scientific understanding. Again, a lot of people are very unfamiliar with this, but it's normalizing that we're going to be using Pacific examples in the classroom. These are just other ways that I've done that. I'm not going to talk to all of them, but I use a variety of different methods to bring in Indigenous knowledges through songs, videos of other practices that maybe are important. I use assessments for students to be able to bring their knowledges into the classroom. So I recognize that they come with knowledge and that they can create a space for them to be able to share it. Poetry, other forms of posters where they're getting, and this process of them creating these posters actually starts to decolonize their understanding of what is science and that their knowledge is important. And also our context is Aotearoa, New Zealand, where we have some quite different political situations around entities and understanding the legal rights of non-living entities as it is. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Fonua. And thank you also for the note about the random order just alphabetically we decided. So following that same order, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Gonzalo Isidro. So Gonzalo, please feel free to introduce yourself and share a little bit about the work that you do.
Yes, thank you for this opportunity to talk to all of you, to connect with you. I'm speaking from the island of Oahu, part of the Hawaiian Islands, and I also recognize the power and the identity of the Hawaiian, the ancestral islands that of these people that continue living here. I come from Mexico originally, and I have an Mexican indigenous background. My parents and grandparents belong to the Tun Sabi people, that is mostly known as Mixtec people. And when I grew up, I was deprived from my heritage language in a way that was intentional. My parents later on in life told me that, well, they apologized for not teaching me the language because at the time they thought that it was the best decision. But growing up, for me, I always had this awareness of their language, that it was a system of communication, but it was also a value system. And for me, that was very important because from early age, I realized that I belonged to a community of people who were migrants, who, even though I grew up in Mexico City, my roots were in a small town in the state of Puebla, and everything was connected to the land, but also to the movement of people. So I had numerous groups of people coming through my parents' home, staying, getting a job in the city, and then moving along. So that was for me really important. So as I became, an adult, and I decided to choose language learning as a lifestyle, as an experience, I chose English because I also wanted to have a language like my parents and grandparents had. I, thought it was important. And I think that the key for me of having been successful was that I knew that languages were just another system of communication. They had values, and they were important in people's lives. So later on, when I became an international educator, part of my job has been to help others become acquainted with a new place, learning a language. And that is how I view my overall my professional life, connected to my upbringing and to my roots. It took me about 30 years before I actually said that in front of an audience, because I always presented myself as a speaker of Spanish or teacher of English in different venues for language teaching, but I never really mentioned that my indigenous roots were so important to me. And I think that just is an example of how many people in smaller communities, in indigenous communities, feel. They just want to thrive. They want to have a career. Whatever they want to do, they do it without acknowledging, without feeling pride of who they are, where they come from. And for me, that's part of what I want to help reverting. So now that I work in the field of international education, I also want to make sure that indigenous students find a way to feel a connection with what they're doing, whether it's, again, education or language learning or getting jobs. So whatever it is, there's a path, and there's a way, and there's also people who we are going to help them, because that's where, at least for me, is my calling. For me, is my way of connecting with my indigenous roots. And down the road, and this is how I connected with Santiago, for example. It's because I submitted an article to a publication in which I was talking about how, for my daily work during the pandemic time, I was using Hawaiian values into our teaching when we were implementing online classes. And this is important because for me, my heritage is not Hawaiian, but I live here. I have a responsibility to empower not only those who are here, but also their values. And when the university made a suggestion that we could incorporate several values into our teaching, I immediately felt that this is exactly how I could connect with, not only with my professional job, but also with where I live, and also with people around the world. So in the implementation of study abroad programs, for international students all over the world, we intentionally chose certain values. And I think that I can try to share with you quickly this presentation, if I could just do it now. And let me see. Okay, I think you can see it. Yes, and okay. So basically, the 5 values are Pilina, Kuike, Aloha, Kulanaike, Ho'opili, Holomau. And these values that are cherished in Hawaiian culture can also be transported into, in this case, into online language learning programs. We call them also study abroad programs. They were the closest that we could do to study abroad program because of the limitations given by the pandemic. I want to go one by one. Pilina, relationship building. This is so important for communities, and this was, of course, disregarded in a time when everything was chaos. But for us, taking the time to develop a relationship with the students, instructors started it, but then they continue, is so important. And it reflects how Hawaiian culture also values, above other things, just the human contact. Another one, Holomau. The fact that continuous repetition, improvement is something to aspire, something that is not only natural, but it's something that you aspire, something that is part of people's goals in lives. It's also something that you can embed into the teaching. And for us, this happened when we were doing assignments and they were happening on a regular basis and there was continuity, but constantly demonstrated improvement so that the students knew that there was a purpose in activities. They were not just random exercises that sometimes, some classes end up having, but they were connected for the purpose of improvement. And this could be language improvement, but also just human improvement because they were connecting, they were learning another language. Ho'opili is also part of like demonstrating that there's a connectedness, that there's a relevance with the rest of the world. It's not just because they're in a class, they're getting credit, but also because they're making a difference in people's lives. And so discovering all these value in the classes as they were doing it, as the substitute for an actual study abroad program, it had a relevance at a time when it was difficult to continue otherwise. Kulanaike, student voice and choice. We wanted to make sure that the students always had a saying into the classroom development, because this is something that sometimes is forgotten. Sometimes the teacher assumes the role of the one who knows it all, the one who leads the way, and without discouraging teachers to having that vision, we also want students to have feedback. And so in the implementation of our online programs, we wanted to make sure that we included that part, their voice. And then, of course, we wanted to make sure that the ku, ike, aloha part was also included, because the instructors were very sympathetic with the situation in which the students were. They were doing their best to continue living life, continue taking classes in a situation where it was difficult. And the teachers were very compassionate and knew that this was the goal of the class, not only because they were getting credit or because it was university mandated, but also because it was the teachers cared about them as individuals. So this is just an example of how I connected with my work and with the everyday of the students' life. And then on my personal side, I actually have undertaken another independent research effort, which has been describing what I call the decolonial turn in the teaching of English as a foreign language to speakers of indigenous languages. And I chose this because in many countries, English is being taught as part of the curriculum, part of the school system, and students from indigenous backgrounds actually have an advantage if they can be aware that their indigenous language is not less than English, even though English is the international language. And also, if the teachers of English can also acknowledge that the native language is an extra element, is of value, and this is important. So I've written a couple of articles in which I describe what teaching methodologies are useful, which ones could provide better scaffolding processes and tasks that teachers can use to make sure that the students who are speakers of indigenous language, who live in small communities, sometimes rural communities, sometimes impoverished areas, they are taking as valuable contributors to the language learning process. And in doing so, we can demystify the goal of imposing a language of instruction which is seen as colonial, in this case English. So this is again an example of what I have been doing in the past, and thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you, Dr. Isidro. Our next panelist will be Dr. Sáez, Hueichapan.
Excuse me. Mari compute inche Doris Piñel, Boldoche Tugun, inche Kimelfe, ingeniería eléctrica, electrical engineer, inche Ayukelem. It's an honor to be here. Really, it's challenging. I would like to show the initiative that we have at the Faculty of Physical and Mathematical Science at the School of Engineering, University of Chile. That we have been working for around 4 years in this subdirector of indigenous people that is consolidating the faculty. And I would like to show some elements that for us are important. This is, excuse me. In our school, we propose this is initiative as integral and excuse me, I cannot see my slide here. Okay, this is an initiative that considers different areas for training students regarding indigenous culture. The idea is to change the curriculum, including lectures for all the students that study engineering or science, consider the language, politics, and culture of multiple nations that we have in our country, Chile, in South America. And the idea is to bring the university community close to the community, indigenous community, in a kinesthetic way. The idea is to face the opportunities and problems related with the people and work in field work with the communities through an offer of social internship, project thesis, many activity with them at the university land and also outside with the communities. Okay, we propose as emissions, excuse me, to promote intercultural and transdisciplinary training in engineering science, in which indigenous and scientific technology paradigm converge in such way to contribute to development of professional scientists who are more integral and aware of the work they carry out, integrate into their work the look of diverse cultures. At the end, our challenge is to build a new knowledge that include the indigenous worldview and the scientific part of acknowledgement. For us, it's essential to be conscious how to address this kind of challenge. It's more focused to the society, it's more focused on territorial and community realities that we have in our country. Okay, well, how to do that? We have 4 kind of activities that are common to all universities in the mission. We have Integration activities that include tutorships, special admission for Indigenous students with special tutorship with the Indigenous worldview. Well, the academic activity includes new lectures that include Indigenous culture, politics, and also but integrate in the engineer course. Well, is our ambition. In currently we have few courses, but we hope to have more. And the thesis and project, the idea is to have project and thesis, master thesis, PhD thesis with the communities in different way where the professors are more involved and work with the community, travel to communities, and this is challenging really. The other things is research, development, innovation activities that imply to apply to project with the communities, but start at the beginning with them, based on their needs, not develop at the university, develop with them in the horizontal way with the communication. Generic publication for us is important to promote our initiative, to show our work, and of course to be here. It's important to us to listen you, and we have some dreams to have a community innovation. Why it's possible to develop better project with the community, and then the people in the city can use that kind of innovations. Okay, also extension and dissemination is important for us. We organized last year in Indigenous Technological Congress. Okay, I would like to just to focus on academic activities and the research. The idea is to strengthen the integral, intercultural, and transdisciplinary training of students of our faculty, integrating, incorporating the Indigenous culture and worldview in the curriculum. That is our ambition, especially incorporating the holistic conception of the world that have the communities. For us, it's important to bring the student close, not just the student. The professor is important, so important to continue with this initiative, closer to the reality of indigenous community affected by extractivists, infrastructure mega projects, and other high-impact interventions in their territories. In our countries, we have a lot of intervention of mining companies, forest companies. That's terrible. Promote lectures that introduce students to the knowledge of indigenous language through the teaching teams, respect culture, put new information communication technology at the service of this process and the service of the communities. Okay, in terms of research, development, innovation, we promote active participatory research with indigenous people in the territory. That is important, but it is difficult. We have to generate a new protocol how to work with the communities. It's not a classical, or we have to decolonizing to do it that with the community. Generate a change of knowledge and innovation with within that framework sets community ethical values and the identity. Of course, in terms of our faculty, they just collaborate in these topics with other universities. We have some initiative in Chile in the south of Chile with other university. At the international level, I would like to obtain some collaboration. It's important for us, the vision of other communities in other parts of the world. Generate institutional research, intercultural higher education, of course, because the idea is to identify the challenge and opportunity, not just problems. It's an opportunity. The community have to say a lot of things about the how to face these opportunities. In curious regeneration publications, of course, also it's our mission as a university. Okay, how to do it? How we do it in our faculty? We organize sites in Circular Council, that is indigenous organization. In terms, we include academics, professors, staff, students. Is organization with indigenous and non-indigenous people that work in cooperative community with the origin horizontal decision maker. That's sometimes difficult because the other part of the faculty are used to be more hierarchical than us, and we have to interact with them. But in our dean, we want to extend to the whole faculty how to organize that. Okay, our vision is to generate community for intercultural education in STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. Collaborate project in congestion joined with the indigenous community in such way to promote the change of knowledge and actively and participate address the significant global challenges at a local community level. And the vision is empathize to have a new student profile that include their identity belong to their origins to permeate the indigenous pride to all of our future professional and scientific. We are convinced that it's important to include indigenous worldview in our curriculum to generate better professionals that consider this vision in the future work for our society. Thank you. That's my participation.
Thank you so much. I think next we will hear from Dr. Sharon Stein.
Hi, everyone. Grateful to be joining you today from Musqueam territory in making this acknowledgement of the Indigenous peoples of the place where I work at the University of British Columbia. I want to affirm my support for Indigenous peoples here and around the world to have their inherent rights recognized, their lands returned to them, and their livelihoods restored. And that includes the Indigenous peoples of Palestine, who are currently being targeted for the last month, over 10,000 dead, almost half of which are children. Today I'm going to share a little bit about the work that I do with my research collective, Gesturing Towards Decolonial Futures, and our sister collective, which is a collective of Indigenous communities in Brazil, and just kind of talk a little bit about the dynamics of our collaboration. And there's much more to say than I have time for, but I will try to be succinct so that we have time for discussion and so that we can hear from Dr. Sumida Huaman, who I'm glad to be going before and not after, because it's hard to follow her. The Gesturing Towards Decolonial Futures Collective is a transdisciplinary, transnational, and intergenerational collective of researchers, artists, educators, students, as well as Indigenous and Afro-descendant knowledge keepers within the collective. And our work really focuses on the questions of education, and in particular, what kind of education is needed in order to prepare people to confront and navigate the challenges we face at the interface of systemic, historical, and ongoing colonial violence and the ecological unsustainability of our current habits of being. And our approach to education is a bit counterintuitive because we don't approach coloniality and unsustainability as if they were problems of ignorance. It's not that, information is unimportant about these things, but we generally find that information alone is not enough to interrupt the modern colonial habits of being that keep us invested in a violent and unsustainable system, a system that really requires harm by design. So the modern promises that we are offered of progress, prosperity, civilization, universal knowledge are really only made possible through colonial processes of genocide, ecocide, and epistemicide. So we say the primary barrier isn't ignorance, but rather denials of the realities of the costs of modern promises. Then we need a different kind of educational process. And we kind of focus on two dimensions of that, which is unlearning harmful cognitive, affective, and relational patterns of the way we think, feel, relate, hope, imagine, desire that continues the existing system, as well as learning to build stamina and capacity to hold space to confront difficult and painful things without becoming overwhelmed or immobilized or looking for quick fixes in relation to those things. And Our sister sort of network is called Teia das Cinco Curas. It's a network of 5 indigenous communities in Brazil. So the rough translation of their name is, the web of 5 healings. And they are really focused on the resurgence of their traditional knowledge systems and practices, as well as the daily fight against them being removed from their lands, facing resource extraction, and also more recently, green energy projects that are really green colonialism projects in many cases. And they're really focused inward on promoting in their communities the kinds of ancestral knowledges that focus on healing and well-being and honor the earth as a living entity. And I'm going to share in the chat when I'm done some links to some of the projects that they've been working on. But we work together in parallel in ways that I'm going to kind of try and describe and map here. Again, more than I can really say in the time allotted. But I've tried to kind of show our relationship between the 2 collectives. And very much our work is centered on relational accountability and how we translate within and across our different contexts toward the work that we're all trying to do. So in many ways, the work of the GTDF collective, my collective, is focusing on education to activate a sense of intellectual and relational accountability that has arguably been numbed by modern education, whereas the Teia de Cinco Curas is focused on revitalizing their own educational systems. And the interface of our work is that, number one, our inquiry in GTDF is very much informed by the Teia de Cinco Curas analysis that the root causes of colonialism is the false sense of separation imposed by modernity that numbs us to our interrelationship with others and therefore numbs us to our responsibility to others. But they're also interested, as much as they're focused on education in their own context and revitalizing that, they are interested in the transformation of education in global North contexts where we mostly work, because they see the connection between the miseducation that we receive here and the effects that this ultimately has on their communities, because our educational system allows the continuity of colonialism that they're fighting against. So we both have our separate inquiries, and we respect the autonomy of their inquiry and try to redistribute resources from the university and from grants to support the work that they want to do. And we try to come together and ask, okay, what from our context do we want to share? And in particular, we ask them, what is it that you all want to get across to communities in the global North that we work to? And how can we make those messages intelligible to the context that we're working in? So honoring the movement and direction that they're trying to push in, while understanding that maybe the language, and not just the literal translation, but the contextual languages are going to be different. And we try and do this work with, number one, a really strong commitment to the long-term relationships. It's really the quality of relationships that's the most important, process-oriented rather than outcome-oriented, trying to follow the principles of trust, respect, reciprocity, consent, and accountability, preparing ourselves and the people we work with to face the complexities and challenges and uncertainties of this work. And I just wanted to give one example, and then I'm going to stop so we can allow Ellie to go, but is like an example of where we kind of worked together in our own context and then had these frameworks that complemented each other based on our own sort of worldviews. So they on their side came up with this idea, and that's what their network is named after, the 5 healings. So they identified the healings of cycles of life and death, of thinking, of feeling, of relations, and exchanges. And we thought in our context, the word justice probably has the kind of political impact that we're looking to make, as well as the pedagogical one. So the kind of parallel translations that we drew were ecological justice, cognitive justice, affective justice, relational justice, and economic justice. So again, it's not just a language translation, but also a cultural translation that tries to honor in particular, their side of what they're trying to communicate. Always going to be imperfect, always going to be something we're constantly negotiating, but it's a commitment that we are trying to work through and facing all the challenges and complexity of, and I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Dr. Stein. And last but not least, we'll hear from Dr. Sumida Huaman. And then after that, we'll have time for some interaction, some questions and answers. So please, if you so far have any questions, any comments, please start sending those along through the chat. And after Dr. Sumida Huaman's time, we'll start moderating those questions. So take it away. Please.
Hi, Anchuka Shankichis, everyone. It's good to see folks. Well, see the panelists. I can't see everyone else. And Dr. Stein is very kind. It's very difficult to follow her, especially after narrating just such a beautiful project. And actually loved listening to all of the beautiful work that folks are engaging at this time. So I'd like to begin with a few assumptions, keeping in mind limitations. First, I want to talk about tribal sovereignty, but I am not a Native North American person for whom sovereignty has shaped the political landscape of my existence. I also want to center Indigenous self-determination, but I come at this as an educator and not as a formal spokesperson for Quechua nations or Indigenous peoples more broadly. I also want to recognize the spectrum of internationalization, and that while there are many good-hearted people who do well-intentioned things, I see points of separation between work that is undergirded by racialization and culturalization and Indigenous-centered efforts. Whether or not we can close those divides and when that happens will be based on meaningful and real relationship building that frankly acknowledges the most economically and politically controversial elements of both settler colonialism and coloniality, which are Indigenous peoples' struggles to protect their land, environment, and peoplehood as we confront development and the very conditioning through education at all levels that comes with it. I'd also like to be clear that on the spectrum of internationalization, my research stakeholders, who are Indigenous people and tribal college and university leaders, faculty, and students, are familiar with several approaches to internationalization work: conventional, semi-critical, and Indigenous and decolonial. And there are points of intersection and points of stark difference in agendas across them. I will confess that as a department reader of student exams, I am often disheartened at the number of graduate students who are still pursuing conventional approaches that remain focused on study abroad and competency metrics, for example. Some students are interested in increasing underrepresented student populations, including Black and American Indian peoples, in internationalization initiatives, but their pursuits remain entrenched in conventional approaches. In other words, keeping the same recipe, but serving it to different people. Perhaps it is due to another limitation of my affiliation with my own institution and less awareness of what is happening elsewhere, but I rarely see Indigenous-led and Indigenous-centered research proposals that aim to redefine internationalization in ways that uplift Indigenous communities and that reconfigure dominant internationalization strategies altogether toward Indigenous needs and priorities. Instead, there's a lot of research on Indigenous and other peoples that actually does not assume the things that we assume, that Indigenous communities are part of larger Indigenous or tribal nations that are inherently global, interconnected, and geopolitically significant, that these nations are centerpieces of alternative notions of sovereignty, that their self-determining efforts are always land-based and globally interdependent. If we as researchers and educators see what Indigenous communities and nations are, and we understand what they need based on long-term relationships, then anything less than co-designed internationalization efforts that are directed at their purposes will remain business as usual and largely unhelpful. In my view, there are two big buckets of purposes, and these are observations based on collaborative land-based educational research and design over the last 30 years with tribal nations, tribally run organizations, and Indigenous serving institutions. The first big bucket is tribal cultural sovereignty. In 2001, Wallace Coffey and Rebecca Sosi wrote a pretty influential article where they asked readers to rethink the tribal sovereignty doctrine. In other words, to open space to consider tribal power beyond the political, and to go deeper within to ask what else Indigenous communities and nations are built upon, if not only treaties, national or federal relations, and very often dominant state-shaped policies and practices. For Coffey and Sosi, cultural sovereignty was a way of framing Indigenous peoples' collective work of naming and protecting what lies within, be it land, language, religious and cultural practices, arts, stories, essentially all of the things that people do and are that can still be cared for beyond the realms of political interference. Powerfully, they expressed the way our ancestors used to think about the things they believed in was perhaps their greatest attribute. They died for their most central beliefs and gave their lives for their most critical possessions. Because of this, we are here today. Cultural sovereignty is their legacy to us. I wish to be clear that the work of cultural sovereignty is the work of Native peoples, reaching back into the past, looking carefully at the present, and individually and collectively determining what sovereignty even means in a particular Indigenous context. According to Coffey and Sosi, this work also includes repatriation of wisdom, land, and cultural identity, meaning knowledge of relationing with places, the places themselves, and the ways in which people have lived with those places through language reclamation and reclamation of our deceased ancestors' remains and their artifacts that have been stolen and misplaced. And I would also argue that this work requires Native peoples, along with strong, kind-hearted, and somewhat selfless allyship, meaning people who are willing to do hard work and take a stand without expecting accolades and career boosts in return. A second bucket of Indigenous purpose that I'll briefly mention is addressing consumerist culture and our participation in it. Philip McMichael wrote that while societies speak of globalization approvingly as a matter of fact, humans are increasingly aware that there are limits to the current global north standard of life. He wrote that there are ecological limits that result in both natural and social limits, and that although over 3/4 of the world's population can access television images of the global consumer, not much more than 1/4 have access to cash or credit to fully participate in the consumer economy. He warned that whether consumer-based development remains a minority activity or becomes a major activity, either way would be unacceptable for social or environmental reasons or both, and that development, as we know it, is in question. As crucial global ecoregions stewarded by Indigenous peoples become increasingly vulnerable to global shift, and as the small percentage of the world's population that speaks Indigenous languages succumbs to language losses, education needs to look at the global marketplace and how it binds all humans. And under such scrutiny, I'm not sure what good is internationalization without attention to environment and development. Furthermore, what good is attention to environment without advocacy for Indigenous peoples' rights to steward their lands and to maintain their knowledges and cultural connections to those lands? Because consumption is based on extraction of materials and labor from the global South and Indigenous communities, we might ask not only how consumption shapes our own and the everyday lives of our students, but also how educational processes themselves have become a form of consumption that extracts materials and labor from Indigenous places in ways that expand the reach of settler colonialism into epistemic mining. So how might internationalization advance tribal cultural sovereignty? And relatedly, how does it serve Indigenous self-determination and the kinds of lives that Native peoples imagine for themselves? How does or can it mitigate the harms of consumerist culture, which continue to fuel the damaging effects of living under conditions of coloniality for people and our more than human benefactors? Based on what I've described, I'm not sure that the language of integration of Indigenous worldviews into anything universities, or internationalization is what is most needed by Native communities. I do, however, advocate for self-reflection on unequal participation in coloniality and the structures that harm Indigenous communities. I encourage educators to rectify erasure of Indigenous histories and land relations, and to then advocate for Indigenous self-determination, including tribal political and cultural sovereignty, decoloniality, and earth healing and restoration work that is being done right now by Indigenous students and community members. Perhaps internationalization stakeholders can consider how higher education can play a more responsible part in helping tribal nations to also produce the kinds of people who will continue to care for their own land relations, as well as cultivating smart and dedicated allies. And this means building direct relationships with communities, nations, and Indigenous serving organizations, committing to collaborative research and program development efforts, and ultimately being prepared to be in these relations for a very long time. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Great reflections. You definitely gave us some food for thought. So we have still like almost half an hour, and we would like to do this a more interactive phase of the webinar. So please, any of the participants, including the panelists, if you have like any comments or any questions, please feel free to either put those in the chat or indicate or raise your hand. We can also, I think, habilitate your microphone if you want to pose your question to the group in a verbal way. Also, among our panelists, if there's anything that you want to ask or follow up with one of your colleagues, this is also a great opportunity to do that as well.
Well, I would like to start by thanking all of you, because I have learned so much from your work. I think I've taken notes, and I would like to follow up with some of the ideas you have mentioned. In particular, I was going to say that Dr. Doris Sáez, Hueichapan, I really like the fact that in the programs of activities that you described, there was an emphasis on the language of the learning of the Indigenous languages in lectures or via lectures, and I think that needs to be multiplied, because it opens venues for speakers of Indigenous language to find a place where they can gather, they can network, they can develop their own ideas, because that's missing, and giving them a place with all the technology and support that universities have, it's really important. My perception of things, again, everything goes back to languages and to revitalizing those languages so that they can take ownership of the processes that need to be done. And then in this case, I concur with Dr. Sumida that yes, it has to be, these voices, the new ideas of internalization have to come from Indigenous peoples in their languages, from their views, and I definitely cannot agree more with you. And again, I found a lot of ideas that resonate with what I do. Thank you very much.
Can you talk? Okay.
Yeah, please, absolutely.
Thank you, Gonzalo. Well, no, we promote the use of language and learn language is important to understand the culture, of course, but also our initiative it has been strong because we are an organization Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, because non-Indigenous people is important. Also, we are in Chile, we are around 10% of Indigenous people, and the university is less than this. And then, yes, I know. I think have to be an organization at the university or the unit that we have. It's strong because the non-Indigenous people contributed a lot of, as some of that here in the panel. And the indigenous people, of course, have to be involved. That I think to do some internalization of higher education, you need an indigenous team, but both sides, because in the intercultural solution have to be from both sides to face the challenge of the society. That's all.
Thank you. I think we've got some questions in the Q&A and the chat, so we are going to present them to the panelists. But meanwhile, please feel free to post your questions in the chat, in the Q&A box. So let's go with this one coming from Michael Smithy. So when we conceptualize internationalization, we are not speaking solely of that which abroad, but also of the indigenous populations.
I can partially address that problem, but others I think will have their own ideas. I think that's a really good question of clarification. So part of what I think my work has been, and in particular working with tribal colleges and universities, there are 37 of them here in the United States, and a number of them in Canada, also Aotearoa, intercultural universities in Latin America as well, is the recognition that Indigenous peoples are, they hold that tribal and cultural sovereignty. So, you know, in the United States, when you enter reservation land, you're entering, in a sense, an autonomous community. In Latin America, when you enter a Native community, you're, you know, from an urban space, you're entering an autochthonous zone. And I think it's really important to recognize that if we take the US example, there are over 570 tribal nations, federally recognized tribal nations here. And people will talk about going from one community to another as if they're going from one country to another. There's a different language, there's different ceremonial and cultural practices. So I think that part of advocacy for internationalization work to transform maybe more toward what Dr. Stein was talking about in terms of justice, the 5 kinds of justices, begins with also recognizing the erasure of Indigenous autonomy and the erasure of Indigenous practices and means of self-determination, and really thinking about the fact that study abroad is not just going from the United States to France or from France to Fiji, but that nation states also contain and in many ways have historically severely subjugated Indigenous peoples that are still fighting for their own distinctiveness and recognition.
Thank you. Anyone else from the panelists to respond to the question? Sure, please.
Sorry. I could probably speak a little bit about the power of administrative labels. And so in Aotearoa, the Indigenous people, tangata whenua, are Māori, but we have many other Indigenous people because we have diasporic populations from the Pacific. But what we do in Aotearoa for administrative reasons is use the word Pacific to refer to all of those different people. So part of this is actually going, stop using this term, actually use the term for the nation that they come from. And it raises complexities around who people are when they're in Aotearoa as well. When they are being labelled as Pacific, but they don't see themselves as Pacific, they see themselves as whichever country they come from or their ancestry comes from. So similarly to what Dr. Elizabeth was saying around, I guess, within a larger land mass, we have lots of small land masses, which administratively have also been allocated different boundaries now, which weren't previously there. So the ease of movement between those nations is changed, and the means of doing so by voyaging is also shifted and changed identity.
Thank you. Any other responses? I guess then we can move on to the second question. I think this was coming from Helen Cunningham on the chat. Such an interesting session, and it feels that there is so much to do, so many changes to make in higher education around the world. I would like to ask, what should be the priorities? If speakers could give one action for priority, what would they choose?
I can have a go at that. I don't know if I like ranking these things, but I think if I could only do one thing, it would be interruption of the status quo and business as usual. Like we can't move anywhere different if we don't stop these patterns that are not just historical patterns, but ongoing patterns. And I think sometimes people don't do that. I mean, there are many reasons why we don't, but sometimes even people who want to are afraid that they don't know what's going to come after we stop doing the harmful things. And sometimes you can only know what comes next once you stop doing the thing that you were doing and you stop and look at how did we even get here in the first place? What have we been ignoring and invisibilizing that has been present, and the costs of what we have been doing? And so in that sense, at least not doing further harm would be perhaps a step in the right direction. And then what the next step after that is, it's going to be contextual to what we're working on and who we're working with and who we're accountable to. But that step of interruption is difficult, especially in education, where we're always like, well, what do we do? And it's like, I want to do something, I want to accomplish something, I want to push something forward. And sometimes we actually just need to pause. And if we don't know the next step, that's fine, just stay in that pause. Yeah.
Well, I really like your response. If I can say a bit more, Dr. Sharon, I'm also a very realistic person because, you know, living overseas, in my case, has allowed me to run into indigenous peoples, even some from the same groups that I belong to, and they have lives in which they are hidden, detached from communities. They still have this identity that allows them to thrive. And I'm talking about specifically the two Unsabi people, the Mixtec people in the US. There are now some growing communities in California and Arizona, and they sometimes speak their native language, plus they're learning English. They sometimes have no knowledge of Spanish. And I'm saying this, that yes, it would be ideal to stop things and have a clean start. But in the meantime, since that's not going to happen, or I don't think that it could happen like immediately, right now there are people with lives that need to be empowered. And I also have felt that because in trying to do something which is actually not interfering with the people who are living in the small communities back where my grandparents live, which is, you know, using social media. And this is just an example that, you know, it's superficial in a way, but I opened a Facebook group for the Mixtec people, for the Tunsabi people, and it has grown. And I monitor it because I want it to be central in revitalization and culture. But other than that, it's very open. And I'm kind of happy that after I opened it in 2012, and it's been growing. It's live, and I do some monitoring. But again, it's I have seen how now the people are posting into Unsabi and are communicating. It's a very slow process, but at least using this technology that connects people who are all over, you know, in different locations, for people who are migrant, by nature are migrant. And yes, they're connected to their lands, but the lands is just their property. It's not like a reservation, like a nation. And even in pre-colonial times, before the Spanish came, the Mixtecs and Zapotecs, for example, lived next to each other. One, you know, was in a hill, the other one was in another hill. So it wasn't really like a nation, but they spoke different languages. So they were already mixed. So it's so vibrant, so different. And yes, I wish there were some tools to help with this process, using the technology tools sometimes. but through education as well. And I think that we all can be part of that in some way, in some fashion. Yeah, that's my wish too.
Thank you, Gonzalo. I think Doris wants to chime in, and then we'll.
Yes.
Yeah, go ahead, Doris.
Well, it's a good question that which I think in our experience it have been very good to go with the authorities to the communities. Last year we organized a school with a school for the scholar students from our faculty in the land land of the communities. It was a workshop from professor from engineer, and we invite our dean and the other dean that involved from the other university, and they couldn't talk with the communities, and it was very interesting. Really, they were enthusiastic. That we think that connection is more. I think could be. It's important to enthusiastic the dean, the rector, and all of them. They have to go to the communities, talk with the people. They can understand in a better way what is important, the intercultural education, this kind of initiatives. This year, my dean, that is the dean of the Faculty of Mathematical and Science, he's very enthusiastic to organize the next school in the communities and invite other deans of the other engineering faculties in my country. That's it. It's my, there are a lot of things to do in our faculty, try to do many things, the international collaboration, to continue with the lectures, change the curriculum. We have a lot of ambitions, but at the end, the authorities they have more, take the decisions, make decisions. That's the point. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Doris. I see that you also contributed to this question in the chat. I don't know if you want to make those remarks live also, or just to the chat. Same, Sonia, I don't know if you want this question. If not, we'll move to the next
one. I was just going to say it's really important to create space for Indigenous peoples to be able to share and lead. So I'm thinking of students having the ability to be able to self-determine that sovereignty to determine what they need, and that requires authentic listening, deep listening, and actually being ready for critique. But that's something that I think would be a really good goal, is how are you creating space for students? Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, there's a couple of other questions in the Q&A box. The first one from Bhuvnesh says, the works undergoing by the panelists is very useful and interesting. I would like to know if their works are supported by any kind of document, like policies or guidelines, or how their work is affecting the existing regulations and structure.
I'll just say, and then I'll put in the chat, that as part of a year-long transdisciplinary program that we had here at UBC last year, we focused on the climate and nature emergency, and we had 4 organizing principles of the recruitment of the participants, as well as the funding calls that we had, and those were ethical collaboration, self-critical rigor, reparative redistribution, and alignment with the university's Indigenous strategic plan. And it was kind of an experiment of to what extent you could repurpose the university and redistribute the resources within it. And it was only a project that happened because the institute that we were working with was going to close. So it was a little window that we could try things, but we documented our learning in that process, and I'll share it in the chat for others who might want to use it as, leverage at their institution about how other ways of doing this kind of thing are possible, even if they're difficult and even if there are failures and mistakes involved.
Another question from Dr. Cristina Yao. He says, I appreciate this panel so much. Thank you for taking the time to share with us. My question is that we often think about making change from a very individual level, yet we rarely talk about the responsibilities that we may have as members of associations or conferences like ASHE, like CIHE. What are recommendations as far as how associations, especially academic ones that we are all involved in, should approach global engagement in a responsible way and including indigenous worldviews?
So I don't know if maybe I can clump these two questions together. So the one before and then this one. So I don't know if this is going to be very clear because I'm just going to kind of talk this through, but the previous question was really interesting to me because it's kind of like, well, how is the work supported? Are there policies? Are there documents? Is there something kind of in place that is sort of agreed upon by perhaps, broader populations? And I think one of the probably clearest examples of that, Dr. Stein could talk about in terms of indigenizing higher education as a result of the Truth and Reconciliation work in Canada. Here in the United States at my institution at the University of Minnesota, we actually have some informal mandates that are becoming more formal, that are the result of a tribal investigator-initiated research project looking at university and tribal relations with the 11 tribal nations here in Minnesota. And the really egregious historical acts that were committed that usurped Indigenous lands, made a lot of money, and displaced Native peoples, and among other horrible things that have happened here. So, it's interesting to me that sort of the onus is on Indigenous peoples and our allies in order to tell the terrible story of why there ought to be perhaps inclusion or recognition of Native peoples. And I think we're talking about kind of two intersecting strands. We're talking about inclusion in higher education, but then we're also talking about the intersecting strand of internationalization, both of which are incredibly colonial. And so I think that, the part of my response to Christina Yao might be, can we rethink the term inclusion altogether? And can we maybe propose a more long-term relationship building strategy that not only recognizes the history and very deep debt that is owed to Indigenous peoples, based on things that have been actively committed by universities. But also that helps to consider ways that tribal nations and Indigenous communities wish to grow. So can it be called something else other than inclusion? Because then at the last minute, associations are scrambling around for somebody to give a land recognition or a prayer or to say something that represents Native peoples. But can we think of it as something other than inclusion? Can we think of it as relationship building? What does it mean to go to these places? If you know that the conference, American Studies Association conference is in Baltimore, Maryland, and you want to include Native peoples from that region and those stories, and this, can you go there a year in advance and begin that relationship building from the start? And what does that look like? Maybe things become very different than an add-on.
Yes, Doris?
Well, this is a good question, really, because my recommendation for academic society, for example, the IEEE, Computation Training Society, and so on, they have to change how to view to the Indigenous people, because Indigenous people we are professional, we are in all the world, and the organization have to change really, or use some useful things of the community. We are more collective. We can have a collective or collaborative leaderships that change a lot of how to do the things. The organization have to be changed in themselves, and also for academic association, I think we have to show a concrete example, how to apply this in the project, how to do it. Examples are very good to convince people that it's important to improve the acknowledgement, I think, how to intersect the indigenous knowledge with the academics or scientific knowledge. That's, we think, that's my, it's two contribution. How to organize the organization is different from the community. In Mapuche culture, we have the Kumoyen, that is good living, that the people have to. We can show to the society and the association how the communities are organized, and try to organize the society like this, and in a collaborative way. And the other thing, it show example that is more concrete. That's all.
Thank you. I guess we are at the time, so unfortunately we have to probably save some questions for further conversation, probably outside of our webinar sometime. Again, I would like to thank our panelists one more time for their time and work and being here with us, and also all the participants who stayed with us until 5:30 p.m. Eastern time, 4:30 Minnesota time, I guess, and also like whatever time zone that you're in. Before we go, I would like to also thank our association for the study of higher education, including Dr. Jason Gilbo here, and also Alicia, who supported us to make this webinar happen. Thank you, everyone, and we look forward to see you at the pre-con in person. Please, again, come by at the social. Hope everyone has great rest of the day. Thank you.